Some words arrive softly, others leave a wound. In intimate relationships, speech is never just sound, it is a psychic imprint. The words we speak, especially in moments of tension or vulnerability, are not random. They are carriers of the unconscious, vessels for our deepest fears, our unspoken histories, our archetypal patterns. Marie-Louise von Franz, the great Jungian analyst and storyteller of the soul, understood this with fierce clarity. She saw language not merely as communication, but as revelation portals through which the hidden aspects of the psyche quietly emerge. We like to believe we mean what we say, but often, we say what we cannot yet face. The shadow, what Jung described as the rejected or unknown parts of ourselves, does not stay silent. It slips through our tone, our phrases, the little repetitions we brush off as just how I talk. And when that shadow remains unintegrated, it becomes dangerous, especially in relationships, where the intimacy of love can tempt us to lower our guard, while someone else's unconscious begins to speak. Von Franz taught that patterns are everything. Repetition, tone, emotional residue, these are the signs. When a man utters a certain phrase again and again, and it leaves you feeling smaller, confused, or somehow responsible for pain that isn't yours, you're no longer dealing with the man alone. You are face to face with his shadow. And if you are not conscious of that moment, if you ignore the coldness beneath his smile, or the sharpness behind his charm, you risk becoming the stage on which his unhealed psyche plays out its familiar drama. This is not about over-analyzing casual speech. This is about listening for the symbols embedded in the ordinary. When someone says, "You're too sensitive," what they may really be saying is, "I'm afraid of my own feelings." When they say, "If you loved me, you would," they might be revealing a deep-seated fear of abandonment, cloaked in control. The psyche rarely speaks directly. It disguises, defends, distorts, but it always reveals, if we are willing to hear. What follows in this book is not a list of to avoid, but an invitation to read between the lines, to recognize when words become weapons, when phrases are less about connection and more about dominance, evasion, or projection. This is not about blame. It is about awakening, because when we begin to see speech as symbolic, as an extension of the soul's inner drama, we stop reacting blindly. We begin to recognize patterns, set boundaries, and most importantly, reclaim our own voice. Von Franz believed that consciousness begins when we stop pretending not to know, and in the quiet moments when someone speaks to you, especially in love, that knowing often comes as a chill in the body before the mind can explain why. Trust that. It might be your psyche, already speaking back. The shadow does not enter the room with a warning. It slips in quietly, through the half-joke, the offhand comment, the way a phrase is repeated until it no longer surprises you. Marie-Louise von Franz, steeped in the symbolic language of myth and fairy tale, knew that the unconscious is never silent. It speaks all the time, especially when we pretend it isn't there. And nowhere does it speak more clearly, or more dangerously, than in the words we use with those closest to us. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is everything we refuse to know about ourselves. It contains not only what is ugly or cruel, but also what is unresolved, undeveloped, or feared. When it remains unacknowledged, it doesn't disappear. It acts out, and often, it does so through speech, through the casual cruelty masked as humor, through the passive comment that lands like a slap, through the charm that leaves you questioning yourself rather than him. These aren't just red flags, they are indicators of a psyche in conflict. A man speaking from a place he has never dared to explore. Von Franz understood that unconsciousness in relationships is not merely unfortunate, it is dangerous. When a person refuses to confront their shadow, someone else ends up living with its consequences. In love, this often falls on the more emotionally conscious partner, the one willing to do the work, to reflect, to give the benefit of the doubt. But the longer one stays in that role, the more distorted the balance becomes. What begins as compassion turns into self-abandonment, and the shadow, unchecked, begins to colonize the relationship. Some phrases are not spoken in malice but are symptoms of deeper psychic wounds. "You're overreacting, you're too emotional, you're not enough." These are not just communication failures, they are projections. The man who utters them is not talking to you, he's talking to his own inner world, one he doesn't yet understand. And if you're not careful, you'll start to believe that his fear, his shame, his inadequacy somehow belong to you, but they don't. Von Franz would remind us that projection is not just a mistake, it's a message. When someone consistently speaks in ways that diminish, confuse, or manipulate, they are revealing a fracture in their own psyche. Your task is not to fix it. Your task is to recognize it for what it is. Language becomes the clue, and once you hear it for what it truly signals, not affection, but avoidance, not honesty, but unconscious pattern, you begin to wake up. To speak from the shadow is human. To live there, unchecked, is not love. It is a slow erosion of trust, of safety, of the soul's ability to stay open. And when certain phrases repeat like a quiet drumbeat in your relationship, it may be time to ask, whose shadow are you carrying? And why have you been asked to hold what was never yours to bear? At first, it may sound like a plea for understanding. You have to accept me as I am. A phrase offered with a shrug, a sigh, or a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. On the surface, it seems harmless, perhaps even noble, a call for unconditional love. But when spoken as a defense, not an invitation, this phrase reveals something far more troubling: the presence of a hardened identity, a refusal to grow, and a subtle demand for the other to shrink. Marie-Louise von Franz would have recognized this as the voice of the fixed persona, the mask we create to survive the world, but which we begin to mistake for the self. It is the voice of a man who has built his identity not on truth, but on avoidance. He clings to the familiar edges of his habits, wounds, and roles, not because they serve him, but because change threatens to unravel what little certainty he has to accept him as he is. In this case, does not mean to love a complex human being. It means to agree to a ceasefire against his shadow, and in that quiet agreement, your own growth becomes the casualty. Von Franz taught that the process of individuation, the journey of becoming whole, requires conscious confrontation with the unconscious. It requires discomfort, challenge, and above all, responsibility. But the man who hides behind this phrase has stepped away from that journey. Instead of meeting his own shadow, he assigns the task to you. You become the one who must adapt, soothe, bend, not because he cannot change, but because he has chosen not to. This phrase is rarely spoken early. It appears after the first rupture, after the moment you question his temper, his distance, his patterns. Instead of curiosity, he offers defense. Instead of dialogue, a wall. And the deeper message beneath the words is simple: I will not look at myself, but I expect you to stay anyway. The tragedy is that many do. Women stay, believing that love means total acceptance, that loyalty means never asking for more. But this is not acceptance, it is abandonment of the self. Von Franz might ask, why do you feel responsible for preserving someone else's limitations? What part of you has been taught that growth is a betrayal? To love someone is not to protect them from transformation. Real intimacy calls both people into becoming, but the man who insists on being accepted as he is, without ever facing who he truly is not seeking love. He is seeking refuge from himself. And if you stay long enough, you may begin to hide from yourself as well. True acceptance begins with honesty, and sometimes the most loving response is not to bend, but to walk away and let him meet the self he's been avoiding all along. When a man says, all my exes were crazy, it may land like a harmless anecdote, a quick dismissal of the past dressed up as honesty, but beneath the laughter or exasperation, something darker often hides. This isn't just a man telling you about his history. It's a man casting a spell, placing himself in the role of misunderstood hero, surrounded by chaos not of his making. Marie-Louise von Franz would have listened to this phrase with stillness, not judgment, because she understood what was truly being revealed: a refusal to integrate, a repetition of shadow, and the quiet poison of projection. This story, always the same shape, no matter how many versions, is rarely about the women themselves. It is about the storyteller's inability to see himself. In Jungian psychology, the refusal to reflect on one's past relationships is not merely emotional immaturity. It's a psychic defense, a denial of the shadow that ensures its return. Each crazy ex becomes a mirror shattered before it can show him his own face. And so the story repeats. The blame rotates, the names change, but the man remains untouched by insight. Von Franz often spoke of what she called the victim-hero complex, the archetype of the man who positions himself as the long-suffering one, the noble figure constantly misunderstood by the women he claims to love. He is not abusive, he insists. He is the victim of unstable women, and yet, somehow, the pattern persists. The chaos follows him, the drama repeats. It never occurs to him more, perhaps, He never lets it occur that the common thread in all these stories is him. When you hear this phrase early in a relationship, it is not a warning about his past. It is a glimpse into your future. Today, it's her. Tomorrow, it's you. Because someone who narrates his life as a string of betrayals has not learned from experience. He has only curated it to suit his own fragile ego, and the deeper danger lies in the temptation to become the exception. You tell yourself you'll be the one to change the story. But stories born from unconsciousness do not change until the narrator does. Von Franz would say that what is not made conscious becomes fate. And a man who repeats this phrase is dragging his fate behind him like a shadowed inheritance. If he has never paused to ask what role he played in the breakdowns, if he cannot speak of his past with accountability or grace, then you are not being invited into a relationship. You are being drafted into a pattern. There is no healing where blame replaces reflection. And no love survives when one person must absorb all the past wounds that another refuses to tend. When a man tells you all his exes were crazy, he is not warning you about them, he is warning you about himself. Listen carefully. That story may be the truest thing he says. If you really loved me, you would. The sentence never quite finishes the same way. One day, it asks for a sacrifice. The next, for silence. Eventually, it asks for your self-abandonment. Dressed as vulnerability, this phrase often arrives early in the life of a relationship, cloaked in the language of closeness. But it is not an invitation, it is a command, wrapped in emotion. Marie-Louise von Franz would have recognized it immediately. The voice not of love, but of a wounded psyche trying to regain control through guilt. At the center of this phrase lives the wounded child archetype, distorted and unintegrated. This is not the sacred inner child that longs for tenderness and connection. It is the regressed aspect of the psyche that demands to be taken care of, not through presence, but through power. This wounded part speaks from a place of old pain, abandonments that were never named, insecurities buried deep and left to rot. And rather than confront that pain inwardly, the speaker externalizes it. Your love becomes a tool to manage their fear. You are given the impossible task of healing what they refuse to hold. Von Franz taught that emotional manipulation often begins in subtle ways, not through rage or cruelty, but through suggestion and implication that love requires obedience. If you really loved me, you'd do this for me. If you really cared, you'd give this up. The unspoken message is always the same. Prove your love by denying yourself. It starts with small things: time, friends, voice, and over time, you stop asking what you need, because the relationship has made your needs feel like a threat. The danger in this phrase lies not only in its demand, but in its logic. It reframes submission as affection, and once you accept that, you begin to believe that boundary is betrayal, that saying no means saying I don't love you. But this is not how love works. This is how fear behaves when dressed up as desire. In the psyche of the one who speaks this way, love is fused with control. It must be measured, managed, proven endlessly. They fear abandonment so deeply that they preempt it through coercion, but the result is the very thing they dread: disconnection, mistrust, loss, because love, when demanded, disappears. Von Franz would not have advised confrontation alone. She would have advised discernment, to hear the shadow for what it is. A cry, yes, but a cry. That is not your responsibility to answer if it comes at the cost of your own soul, because the moment love becomes a test, it is no longer love. It has become a bargain. And what it wants in return is your freedom. You do not owe proof of love to anyone who tries to buy it through guilt. Love that must be begged for, traded, or enforced is not love. It is fear in disguise. And fear, no matter how softly it speaks, should never be the one guiding your heart. You're too sensitive. It's said with a shrug, a smirk, or a tired sigh, as if the problem isn't what was done, but how deeply it was felt. At first, you might question your reaction. Maybe you are overreacting. Maybe you are imagining things. But the more often you hear it, the less you trust your own perception. This phrase doesn't just dismiss a feeling, it rewrites reality. Marie-Louise von Franz would have recognized it as a quiet act of psychological violence, one that undermines intuition and pushes the emotional burden onto the one who speaks from the heart. Sensitivity, in the Jungian sense, is not weakness. It is receptivity to the unconscious, a heightened awareness of inner and outer signals that others often miss. Von Franz saw it as a form of wisdom, especially in women, and attunement to archetypal truths, to subtle energies, to the symbolic language of soul. But when a man calls you too sensitive, he is not describing you, he is disowning something in himself. He is projecting his own discomfort with emotion, with depth, with vulnerability, onto the very person who reflects it back. This phrase is a defense, but not an innocent one. It implies that the emotional reality of the moment is invalid, exaggerated, wrong. It forces you to carry not only your own feelings, but his refusal to feel, and over time, the impact is corrosive. You begin to dull your reactions, swallow your truth, minimize your needs, not because they've gone away, but because you've learned they will not be welcomed. This is not compromise, it is erasure. Von Franz understood that men who fear the feminine often attack it in symbolic form. Sensitivity, for them, is threatening because it cannot be controlled. It asks them to reflect, to soften, to feel. But if they have not integrated that part of their own psyche, they will try to destroy it wherever they see it, especially in the woman closest to them. You re too sensitive becomes a curse laid on the very gift they most need to recover in themselves. When this phrase becomes a pattern, it is not a sign of incompatibility, it is a sign of danger. Because a man who pathologizes feeling will eventually make you question your very way of being. You will find yourself apologizing for hurting, for noticing, for being moved, and in doing so, you will lose access to your own inner compass. To feel deeply is not a flaw, it is a mirror held up to a world that has forgotten how. Von Franz would remind you that sensitivity is a strength of soul, echo of the unconscious calling you home, and any man who cannot sit with your sensitivity is not rejecting you, he is running from himself. Let him, but you do not need to follow. You're not enough for me. It lands like a quiet betrayal, a phrase that drains the light from a room. Often it isn't shouted, it arrives in a moment of distance, uttered with cold precision, disguised as honesty. But beneath its surface lives something far more toxic, a projection, not a truth. Marie-Louise von Franz would have seen this as a wound speaking, not a judgment. A man who says these words isn't revealing something about you, he's exposing a vast and unexamined emptiness within himself. The archetype at work here is the wound of unworthiness. It is old, collective, and deeply rooted in the shadow. Jung taught that what we cannot accept in ourselves, we unconsciously project onto others, and this phrase is a perfect example. A man who feels inwardly broken, inadequate, or unlovable will often escape the pain of that realization by placing it onto someone else. Not enough for me becomes the veil he uses to avoid admitting that nothing ever is. No partner, no achievement, no intimacy can fill the void he refuses to face. For the woman on the receiving end, this phrase is especially cruel because it strikes at the heart of a universal fear, that we are somehow unworthy of love, as we are. It does more than hurt, it activates a frantic need to prove. Suddenly, love becomes performance. You try harder, give more, reshape yourself around his dissatisfaction, hoping one day it will be enough. But the goalpost always moves, because the emptiness inside him is not yours to fill, and no amount of devotion will make him whole. Von Franz understood that such dynamics quickly become addictive. The intermittent approval, the emotional highs and lows, the constant sense of almost but never quite being accepted. These relationships mimic the structure of a fairy tale turned dark, where the heroine is asked to complete an impossible task to earn the prince's affection. And just like those stories, it's never the task that's the problem, it's the spell. In truth, the spell was never yours. It was his, long before you arrived. A man who weaponizes your worth to mask his own pain is not a partner, he is a warning, and to stay with him too long is to begin forgetting your original shape, mistaking his wound for your reflection. The antidote is not revenge, it's remembrance of who you were before the words, of what you've survived, of the fact that your value was never meant to be measured through the lens of someone else as self. Von Franz might remind you, no one who truly sees you would ever ask you to become less in order to be loved more. That is not love. That is projection in its most seductive form. Walk away. Not because you are not enough, but because you always were. Do whatever you want. The words themselves sound permissive, even generous. But the tone betrays them flat, cold, sharp around the edges. This isn't permission, it's punishment. A quiet dare laced with resentment, meant to confuse rather than clarify. When spoken in this way, the phrase becomes a form of covert aggression, a manipulation that retreats behind silence while demanding obedience. Marie-Louise von Franz would have recognized this voice not as an expression of love, but as the whisper of the negative animus, a distorted masculine force that wounds by withholding. Where overt control shouts, passive control whispers, it hides inside ambiguity, sarcasm, and detachment. In Genjin terms, the negative animus is not the healthy, generative masculine principle that seeks truth and clarity, is its shadow twin. It speaks in riddles, weaponizes logic, and punishes through emotional distance. The man who says do whatever you want in this way is not letting go. He is baiting you. He is watching to see whether you will act freely or act fearfully, whether you will disobey the rule he refused to name. Von Franz wrote often of how the masculine psyche, when disconnected from the heart, becomes rigid and punishing. It cannot tolerate vulnerability, so it seeks power in disguise. And this phrase is precisely that, power cloaked in nonchalance. You are given the illusion of choice, but underneath it lies an unspoken threat. If you do what you want, he may retaliate not directly, but through withdrawal, silence, guilt. If you try to decode him, you will find yourself trapped in a loop of second-guessing, where clarity is always just out of reach. The cost of staying in this pattern is subtle but corrosive. You begin to mistrust your instincts. You start scanning his moods, adjusting your behavior to avoid the next cold wave. You start walking on emotional eggshells, not because you've done something wrong, but because he won't say what he actually feels. And when the reality of his manipulation starts to surface, he slips back into ambiguity. I never told you what to do. You made your own choice. And so you carry both the blame and the silence. Von Franz would tell us that the way out of this trap is not through confrontation alone, but through reclaiming your clarity. The shadow cannot survive the light of honest perception. If someone expects you to read between the lines, stop reading. Take the words at face value. Respond not to the game, but to the truth you know underneath it. A man who speaks from love does not test your loyalty through silence. He does not punish you with distance for making a choice. He names what he feels, even when it's hard. And if he won't, then your freedom must become the clarity he refuses to offer. Because real love never hides behind veiled threats. It stands in the open, willing to be seen. You're overthinking it. The phrase lands like a gentle correction, a nudge toward simplicity. But underneath its calm exterior lies a quiet form of gaslighting, one that dismisses not just your thoughts, but your very way of knowing. It suggests that your depth is a flaw, that your perception is excessive, and that the complexity you feel is not only inconvenient, but wrong. Marie-Louise von Franz would have heard this not as harmless logic, but as a direct rejection of the feminine psyche's natural intelligence. In many relationships, this phrase is used to shut down emotional intuitionists, especially when it begins to uncover uncomfortable truths. It often appears when a woman voices a subtle concern, when she picks up on the mood that doesn't match the words, the contradiction between tone and gesture. She brings it forward carefully, naming what isn't being said. And instead of being met with curiosity, she is told she is thinking too much. But von Franz knew that women's thoughts are rarely separate from their feelings. In the feminine mode of consciousness, thought and emotion are often one and the same, a form of embodied knowing that lives just beneath the surface. To tell a woman she is overthinking is not simply to doubt her logic. It is to suggest that her inner life is not trustworthy, that the web of associations she naturally weaves, the memories, sensations, dreams, gut instincts, is nothing but noise. It is to exile her from her own intelligence, and in doing so, the speaker asserts not only dominance, but a false clarity. His refusal to reflect becomes a claim to reason. Von Franz often wrote of the danger of an unbalanced masculine principle, what she and Jung described as logos without eros, intellect without feeling. When the mind detaches from the heart, it loses its grounding in life. It begins to divide, to simplify, to erase. This is the psychic root of the phrase, you re-overthinking it, a mind that has become so afraid of emotion, of nuance, that it can no longer recognize truth when it comes in feelings form. But the feminine psyche knows differently. It knows that intuition is not irrational, it is ancient. That complexity is not confusion, it is wisdom unbound by straight lines. And that emotional insight is often the first language of the soul, not the last. To be told you are overthinking when you are, in fact, perceiving something real is not a statement about your mind. It is a statement about his limits. So the question is not whether you are thinking too much. The question is whether he is willing to meet you at the depth you naturally inhabit, and if he cannot, von Franz would urge you not to come up to meet him, but to stay rooted in the rich soil of your own knowing, because what he calls overthinking may be the very voice that saves you from forgetting yourself. You need me. It can sound like a declaration of love, a promise of support, even a vow of protection, but when spoken from the wrong place, it becomes something else entirely, net cast around your autonomy, a subtle rewriting of your story, where your strength is replaced by his imagined rescue. Marie-Louise von Franz would not have taken these words at face value. She would have listened for the shadow beneath them, the possession disguised as care, the control disguised as devotion. The man who says this may believe he is being generous. He offers help, guidance, even rescue. At first it feels good to be seen, to be chosen as someone worth helping. But slowly, the dynamic begins to change. His presence grows heavier. His concern begins to sound like critique. His support becomes conditional. What was once generosity is now authority, and the deeper message becomes clear. Your well-being depends on me. Von Franz often warned about archetypal inflation. When someone identifies too strongly with a role like the savior or the guide, what begins as service turns into identity, and suddenly, the relationship is no longer two souls meeting, but one person elevated and the other quietly diminished. In this arrangement, your independence threatens him, your clarity unsettles him, because if you are whole, where does he fit? If you don't need saving, what does he have left to offer? Dependency, in this context, is not accidentally, is cultivated. He may subtly encourage your doubt, amplify your uncertainty, frame his involvement as indispensable, and if you begin to pull away, you might hear it again. You need me, not as comfort this time, but as warning. Because the line between protector and captor is thinner than we like to believe, especially when the bond is emotional, and the control is cloaked in concern. Von Franz would have seen this for what it is, not love, but a fear of irrelevance. A man who needs to be needed often fears his own inner emptiness. Instead of facing it, he seeks out others to hold it for him. He becomes essential, not because he truly gives, but because he cannot bear to be unnecessary, and the woman becomes a character in his script, grateful, reliant, bound. But you were never meant to be saved, and real love doesn't require your dependence to survive. It respects your evolution. It does not shrink when you grow. It does not tremble when you no longer reach for its hand. If a man tells you that you need him, ask yourself, has he made space for you to stand on your own, or has he simply made it harder for you to remember? Love should never be a trade for freedom. Help, when true, empowers. Anything else is just control dressed in concern, and concern that cages is no concern at all. There is a reason these phrases slip past the alarm bells. A reason they echo in the mind long after they've unsettled the heart. You're too sensitive. You need me. If you really loved me, you would. These are not just manipulations of the moment, they are invitations into an archetypal trap. And often, the woman who hears them doesn't run. She explains, adjusts, forgives, not because she's blind, but because something deeper is at play. Marie-Louise von Franz understood that what keeps a woman in the orbit of these words is not weakness, it is myth. We are not just reacting to the man in front of us, we are responding to something ancient, something psychic, a pattern passed through generations, stories, collective memory. A woman may stay in the dynamic not because she doesn't see the harm, but because, on some level, it feels familiar. In Jungian terms, she has entered the field of the anima projection, not her own, but his. He sees in her a symbolic figure, not a person. She becomes the container for his emotional life, the reflection of his mother, his muse, his shadow, and without knowing it, she begins to mirror the role he expects. Bending not out of obligation, but out of unconscious recognition. But projection is never one-sided. Many women carry within them the fantasy of the wounded man, the one they alone can fix, the one whose love must be earned through sacrifice. This is the rescuer archetype, deeply romanticized and dangerously misunderstood. It tells her that staying is noble, that loving him harder will soften him, that suffering is a path to meaning. And when he utters these phrases, when his shadow spills into the relationship through subtle cruelty or passive control, she doesn't just hear manipulation, she hears a call to prove her love, to redeem the broken, to endure. Von Franz warned of this dynamic often. She saw how easily the unconscious draws us into roles we do not choose but enact over and over. until we become aware, until we step back, until we name what is happening not just in the room but in the soul. She believed that healing comes not just from setting boundaries, but from understanding the story we've been living inside. Because only then can we stop playing the part. If you find yourself rationalizing what hurts, minimizing what confuses, staying when everything in you knows better, ask, what pattern is pulling at you? Is it love, or is it myth wearing love's costume? Until you see your role in the repetition, you will keep rewriting the same chapter, with different names. This is not about blame. It is about recognition. The phrases work because they are speaking not only to you, but to the part of you that was taught love means losing yourself. Von Franz would remind you, it doesn't. And the moment you know that, the story begins to change.